Welcome here to Hudson Institute. Thank you to all of you who are joined in person, and for those joining us online, welcome to you as well. I'm very excited today because I get to launch a new book from one of my very good friends, Rebeccah Heinrichs, Hudson's Own. And of course, Rebeccah needs no introduction, but for those who don't know, she is a senior fellow here at Hudson Institute, and she's also the director of the Keystone Defense Initiative here. And you've probably seen her all over on the news. She's on Fox News, Fox Business. Whenever you flick on your TV, you'll often see her on those shows talking about what it takes to have a strong America, a strong national defense, and someone who I respect greatly. And it's very exciting that we are here today to launch her new book, Duty to Deter, American Nuclear Deterrence and the Just War Doctrine. And we're going to talk about that today, and at the end we can maybe have a few audience questions and go from there. So Rebeccah, thank you so much for just allowing us to launch your new book, and this is exciting. And I wanted to first kind of talk about, even before we just get into the substance of everything, just how did you arrive at this topic, talking about, we find ourselves in this modern Cold War, and we're adapting our nuclear deterrence, and you really talk about the intersection between that and Just War Doctrine. How did you arrive at this?
Sure. Well, thanks for those of you who came today and who are watching online, and it's so good to do this with you too. Yeah. So this is my first book and my only book, and I think it will be the only book I ever write. So I really swung for the fences with this one, talking about morality in American nuclear deterrence. But really, I started thinking about nuclear issues all the way back when I was in college. I think I've mentioned this to you before, maybe in the past, how I even got started in national defense policy, but I was a freshman in college when 9/11 happened. Wow. And it was very, very formative for me because that was the beginning of when I started studying American political philosophy. And so it was this time, very formative, studying American political philosophy, and then also having this really harsh reminder that there are actors and nation states that wish us great harm, and the ideas matter a great deal. Yeah. And then it occurred to me that as bad as Islamist radicals are, things could get a whole lot worse. And so my mind kind of quickly jumped beyond low intensity conflict in the Middle East, although that was something that was, a lot of people my age kind of signed up and went in and signed up and joined the fight in Afghanistan and Iraq. My studies took me to looking back at how we navigated the Cold War. How did we prevent what would be a catastrophic war with the Soviet Union? Because my view was that this could happen again. And so that was all the way back in 2001. So that's where my interest started. And then my formal studies continued, and then I was approached by the editors of Providence magazine, whose whole purpose is to write about Christian morality and American foreign policy. And they said, listen, we know that you have a strong interest in these issues. Would you write for us? And so I started writing for them. And then in conclusion, I initially wrote a long form essay that was basically this book. And I turned it into the publisher, who ended up being the man who wrote the foreword to my book, Dr. Keith Payne. And he told me he appreciated my strong enthusiasm for the subject, but I needed a lot more study, that there was a lot more out there to understand the issue. And so with that, he said, why don't you get your doctorate in this? And so I pursued my doctorate, and then this was my doctoral thesis, which then he was kind enough to publish.
That is amazing. That is amazing. And can you talk a little bit about the conclusion that you arrive at? You're saying that modern nuclear deterrence is actually important to comply with just war theory. Not only does it comply, but actually we have a duty to do this. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, my audience for this. So I started thinking, if we're now 40 years from the Cold War. And part of what you need for successful deterrence at all. So what is deterrence? Deterrence is credibly convincing your adversary that you have both the capability and the will to cause your adversary to regret his act of aggression against you. And you want to convince him of that before he acts with aggression against you. Right. And that's how you maintain deterrence. Well, at the highest level of that, our largest national security insurance policy is our nuclear deterrence. And then we have a nuclear deterrence, and then our nuclear deterrence really is the basis, the foundation on which our entire national defense strategy is then built.
Absolutely.
And so in order for it to be credible, in order to convince your adversary that you're willing to use these things, you have to be convinced in your own mind that you also would be willing to use them. Otherwise, it's just a bluff, and bluffs don't work. So it was important for me as I thought about this. Oh my goodness, I got my master's from the U.S. Naval War College, and I realized that many of my classmates were sort of confused about the rightness of what the United States was doing in a variety of conflicts. And I thought, well, if our academies, our military academies, our military schools aren't teaching that it's right to do what the United States does in the world militarily, and then we're on shaky ground from a deterrence perspective. And so I really was thinking about the operators, those who are going to be flying our bombers, those who do fly our bombers, those who sit out there in our missileers for our ICBM silos, for those who go out for months with our submarines. I wanted these young men and women to have a clear conscience to protect them from moral bruising about what they are doing in the event that they are called to employ a nuclear weapon. But I wanted them to have that confidence because that also bolsters the credibility of our deterrence strategy.
Right.
And then, of course, I want policymakers and I want Americans and our allies to understand how we see ourselves as a country and how we think about nuclear weapons. Because the way the United States thinks about nuclear weapons is very different than the way the Russians think about nuclear weapons, than the Chinese think about nuclear weapons. And so in Christian speaking, we are the lesser magistrates. We are in a democratic society. We are the ones who are governing as well, we as private American citizens. And so it's important for us to understand ourselves and how we think about these things.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And how do you think, too, how do we continue to teach the next generation about this? I was explaining to you, just even when I was at West Point, we had a couple classes on this and dealing with the kind of ethics of it, but it really is important the next generation understands the importance of it. And how do we continue to kind of inculcate those values?
No, this is so important, I think, also because we're kind of sort of the post-Christian society. And so people want to talk about morality, but they don't want to talk about where we get it from. Right. And that's a problem. So I think sort of being unabashed, say, listen, you do not have to be a person of faith yourself to understand that. A lot of the way the West thinks about proper conduct in warfare comes from the Judeo-Christian thinking. And so you should understand it. If you're a citizen of it, you should understand Absolutely. It. And we shouldn't shy away from that. We're having a lesson right now as Israel prosecutes its defensive war against Iranian proxies. You hear lots of people in the media talk about whether or not Israel is complying with the laws of armed conflict, or whether or not Israel is being discriminatory, whether or not Israel is being proportionate. All of these concepts are concepts from the Just War Doctrine. We get the laws of armed conflict, international law, from the Just War. How the United States holds ourselves accountable. We're not a part of the International Criminal Court because we want to maintain our own sovereignty. Yeah. But it only works if we really hold ourselves accountable. Right. Well, what do we appeal to? Well, we appeal to the Laws of War Manual, which is our interpretation of the laws of armed conflict. And if you read it, it directly appeals to principles of the Just War Doctrine.
Absolutely.
And so I think it's just kind of unabashedly getting back to, where do these ideas come from? Let's go back and look at them, and are they still true? And are they still meaningful? And I concluded, of course, yes, they are.
Yeah. And in your book, you talk a lot about this kind of dichotomy of realism versus idealism. Why is that important? Why did you focus so much on that?
Yeah, so I have found that in an age of populism, there is sort of a fight over who is the most realistic. And some people say, look, the United States has fought wars that were idealistic, and so we are the realists. And sometimes the claim is sort of erroneously made that realism means an absence of consideration for morality. And I argue that it cannot be true, because an action or an inaction is still going to come out of your understanding of what is right, based on your own country's understanding of, yes, your interests, but your interests based on what? American interests are completely rooted in what we believe is the best way to conduct international affairs. when we say we want peace based on what? Well, we want free and international waters. We don't believe that the Russians can just smash a country and take it based on these ideas of 9th century ownership over lands and people. And so, so it's important. It was important for me to kind of set the table by saying the Just War Doctrine was thought of, as conceived of, for people of conscience who also understood that in this real world that is fallen and imperfect, in which people are going to act in ways that are not going to be good for everybody, a good, just government must think about morality as it defends its people and its nation, and then each soldier must also think about these things, that you do not have the license to do things that are inherently immoral, even in war, that there are still duties to restrict you and duties to compel you. And that's really what the Just War Doctrine is. So it is, I make the argument that the Just War Doctrine is for realists. It is for those who want to behave morally, but understanding that war is sometimes a necessity for a greater good, which is justice.
Absolutely. And I want to talk a little bit about just the threat landscape right now. What is your assessment of the likelihood of nuclear war, and kind of where do you think everything sits as of right now?
So that's another reason for this. So I kind of gave you the long background for why I've been thinking about these issues for a long time, but then really the timeliness of this publishing it now is really because I see that we're in another Cold War. Yeah. Only it's unprecedented in the degree of the challenge for the United States, and also what's at risk, that the stakes, because for the first time, we're not just deterring one imperialistic nuclear adversary. It's not just the Soviet Union, it's not just Russia, it's also China. Yeah. We've never had to deter two major nuclear powers, both seeking to threaten what the United States values a great deal. And so it's my assessment, and this is from my work on the Bipartisan Strategic Posture Commission as well, is we really are, as Americans and allies, almost certainly going to have to adapt our nuclear deterrent, just like Americans had to go through during the Cold War. And what happens is, just during the Cold War, Reagan is saying we're going to have to build up. Even if we want someday a world with no nuclear weapons, today is not the day. Right. And so we're going to have to build up. And what happened was a lot of very well-meaning people of Christian faith came out, and they were the loudest opponents of nuclear buildup, arguing that this was inherently wrong and bad and dangerous. Mm-hmm. And so I spent a lot of time arguing why they were mistaken then, and why we have to learn why they were mistaken then, because we're almost certainly going to have to make adaptations today that are going to bring out the same kind of allergy to making some changes. And so it might be more numerous nuclear weapons. I think it's inevitable that we will if China continues to build up. Yeah. But it's also going to be theater nuclear weapons, closer to the adversaries and deployed with our allies. It's probably going to be more missile defense systems, which in the past people thought was destabilizing. I argue it's actually good. So I'm trying to prepare us and equip people to say, okay, there is a moral argument in defense of things that are going to increase the credibility of our deterrence.
Absolutely. How your book talks a lot about Russia and China. How does some people kind of define this new axis of evil to include North Korea and Iran, as they're all kind of working together? We've seen some of the videos coming out of North Korean soldiers joining the Russian fight. I mean, so how does that fit in with these other kind of new countries that are trying to enter the nuclear space? How does that work? Yeah,
great question. So the way the United States does deterrence, and our strategy is, we size the force and we look at our targeting based on the countries that pose the greatest threat, because then you can fit in sort of rogue state actors within the capabilities that we have. So I spend a lot of time on the hardest problem, because they have the most nuclear weapons, the most economic power to do great harm. And so I focus on China and Russia, but certainly North Korea is a very serious nuclear rogue state. One that we have to defend against. And we have different strategies for, our current missile defense system is designed to protect the American homeland from North Korean nuclear missiles. It's not designed to defend against Chinese or Russian nuclear missiles. And part of that is a hangover from the Cold War, thinking that you want to remain mutually vulnerable with peers so that you could threaten, second strike against their countries. But we didn't. But President Bush, 43, withdrew the United States from the ABM Treaty in 2002, 2003, and then built an initial very limited missile defense system. I argue in here that it is time now to close our vulnerabilities against the Chinese and Russian threat as well, because they understand that that's been a weakness of the United States, and so they've sought to hold those things at risk coercively against the United States. And last point on this, I don't spend, as I was writing this, sometimes I'm like, oh, this deserves like 10 more pages on this thought, but it's not really the focus. And so I just kind of noted it. So there's basically 50 books inside this book that other people should read this and be like, she barely talked about this and you should go write about it. One of them, though, is U.S. extended deterrence to our allies and how the rest of the West is going to, should be thinking about this too. And so that's something that deserves a whole nother treatment. But finally, I would just say, it's still in U.S. interest to ensure that Iran does not become a nuclear power. It's much harder to deal with that problem, and then they have coercive leverage over the United States than it is to just ensure that they do not become a nuclear power. And so that's why I'm very supportive of Israel's efforts to make sure that Iran does not actually cross that nuclear threshold.
Absolutely. So you're saying that you have like 50 more books you're going to be writing soon?
Oh, not me. This is for you all. Yes, this is the assignment.
That's awesome. Well, on that note, I want to talk too just about who you see as the audience for the book and kind of your thoughts on who we should be thinking of getting this book in the hands of.
Yeah. So it is, although I make direct appeals to Christian theology, and I really even, I don't shy away from it, understanding that though the United States is no longer sort of culturally Christian in the way we used to think about it even 20, 30, 40 years ago, if you still look at those who are in the military, most of them say that they're at least nominally understand Christianity, or that they call themselves Christians. And so I do make direct and explicit religious appeals to Christian theology, pointing to the Holy Scriptures. However, I want to make clear, it's not just for people of faith, it's not just for Christians. Clearly we have strong Jewish tradition in the Just War Doctrine that also deserves its own book. But so it's for people of all faith, and if you're of neither of those, you can still understand living in the United States. You're still benefiting from Christian, Judeo-Christian thought that has given us the freest, most prosperous country in the world. And so I want to kind of put that out there. So it is for everybody in that regard, but it's for the private citizen who just wants to understand. There's a new book out that's really scaring people about nuclear weapons, Annie Jacobson's book, and so I've noticed some podcasts where people kind of talking about, like, oh no, nuclear weapons are bad. They do have great catastrophic potential of creating lots of human loss of life. So I think I appreciate the book because it's making people sort of aware of this problem and this threat. But I think it's important to have clear eyes and clear thinking then about how you can actually prevent nuclear war from happening, not just having a strong desire. Because one of the judges for morality in thinking about warfare is not that you just have a really strong desire for peace. Lots of people, you can really, really, really be against climate change, and so you go glue your hands to the pavement or you throw paint on the Mona Lisa. But is that actually affecting the change that you want? I would argue it's not. It's very destructive. So you're actually judged not just on your sincere desire, but on the outcome. Does your action or your inaction get you closer to the outcome you want? And I pretty forcefully argue that those who want disarmament or nuclear pacifism, which is nuclear weapons are fine to have as long as you don't ever use them. And I hope you see the logical problem with that, because deterrence relies on the credible threat of using them.
Right.
So you have to have a nuclear force that you're willing to use should deterrence fail, understanding that deterrence is still your primary objective. And so I want I just want for the private citizen, I try to write it in a way that was understandable for everybody, not too wonky, even though it's a doctoral thesis. but it's for the strategists out at Stratcom, for those who are the operators who have the great mission and who have accepted the mission to operate our triad. Yeah. And then hopefully it's for the Congress and the next administration to understand that you're not going to get us closer to peace by disarming or failing to adapt the deterrent, that you need to constantly adapt it to make sure that you are complying with the principles of the Just War Doctrine.
Absolutely. And as I asked this last question, if there are any audience questions after this, we're happy to answer those as well. I want to talk just a little bit about the writing process. I mean, you said it was your doctoral thesis. What did you enjoy about it? Anything you would do differently looking back? And also, how long did it take you?
Oh my goodness.
This was like 3 questions in one, but yeah.
So like I said, the first time I wrote an essay on the subject to turn it in to Dr. Keith Payne to print, it was, I want to say 5 or 6 years ago, where he read it and he wrote back and said, I am so glad you're interested in this subject, Rebeccah, but there's so much more out there. I mean, the thing that surprised me in my study is not just, I think that, my understanding now from having gone through this is people will write a book because they intuitively believe something is true. I think this is true and I don't hear anybody else talking about it saying, so I should write a book about it. But then when you really start studying it, you actually learn things that you didn't previously know. And in my case, is that that it's not just that American nuclear weapons can comply, and I think do, and we can even be better at it, comply with the Just War Doctrine while also making them credibly deter our adversaries. But the United States has actually been doing this. That we, in parallel, since World War II, as the United States has sought to adapt it, for strictly, so I'm not suggesting that there were sort of like priests and theologians sitting out in Omaha sort of coming out, or on the joint staff who were like, how do we make this, how do we please Augustine here and Aquinas? It wasn't that kind of self-awareness. But certainly during the Cold War, Schlesinger went before the committees, before the House Armed Services Committee, Senate Armed Services Committee, and made strong arguments, moral arguments, for why we need to adapt the nuclear posture the way we believed it would. And there were senators. It's amazing. You can go back and read transcripts. Like, this is back when hearings were fruitful and people were
actually productive. Yeah,
they were actually trying to get to truth. Yeah. It's amazing. You can kind of see them arguing and understanding things and pushing back. And so to me, that was encouraging to me that we can still do that. That's not lost. I mean, we might not be great at that now, and it's a lot of demagoguery and people kind of showboating in hearings, but you can still go back and there can be smart, good Americans of goodwill from both sides of the aisle understand that we got to get this right. And so my hope is that it's inspiring for members of Congress too, so they don't sort of get wobbly-kneed if they have constituents come in and say this is immoral. Actually, no, I've at least know somebody over here making the argument that the necessary changes based on strategy are also we should do with a clear conscience. They're right and good.
That's right. That's right. Awesome. Well, if there's anyone in the audience with a question, sir, yes.
You brought me back to wondering about EMPs, I guess, and wondering if we now have the capacity to take out the grid and put people back to the Stone Ages as far as technology. Or do you cover the morals versus nuclear kill rates versus technology destroying where you could just disable the economy?
So I don't go into specifics on the nature of that particular attack and the casualties that it could cause. I mean, I certainly think it still fits into the paradigm of deterrence and what we're trying to deter. In the case of an EMP, you're still going to be talking about deterring an adversary from employing a nuclear weapon. It's just the nature of that deployment obviously would create an EMP effect. I do spend time kind of going back and making the case because it's a good question. It makes me, one of the reasons that people have argued that nuclear weapons in particular could never comply with the Just War Doctrine is because their inherent capacity to cause great casualties, high numbers of casualties. And so that folks have argued that they inherently violate the discrimination and proportionality principles of the Just War Doctrine. And certainly you could say because just of the sheer number. But in fact, there have been studies all the way back from the Cold War and as late as the early 2000s where we looked at, no, actually, if you deploy a nuclear weapon, a burst, a high altitude burst versus a ground burst versus doing it over a city versus doing it over an ICBM field versus doing it, you can create all different physical effects that bring with them different consequences for civilian harm that maybe you understand might happen, but you lament, but it's something that you can take for the military and political objective that you're seeking, versus another kind of employment that would violate that. And so it's a good question, but I don't get into that specific way of employing a nuclear weapon, but I do discuss that there are certainly different ways that you can that have enormous consequences for whether or not it would violate the just war.
Thank you. Rebeccah, first of all, just a superb presentation. Congratulations on the book. Two questions, basically, to go together on capabilities. One, what do you say to critics of the land-based missile component of the triad and whether or not that's as essential as our submarine and bomber capabilities? And secondly, what do you sense, or what do you know about the technologies on missile defense to deal with this new hypersonic missile technology?
Great question. So now we're getting, so the triad, for those of you, it's the primary way that the United States has structured our deterrent. So 3 different delivery systems from sea, from land, and from the air. And our ICBMs are our land component of our triad. Each leg of the triad brings with it certain characteristics that when you complement all of them, they provide, we think, the greatest chance of successfully maintaining deterrence. And the great thing about our ICBMs is a couple of things. One, obviously, this is sort of our, you are going to, it's our greatest insurance policy. It is our greatest insurance policy for the existence of the United States in terms of our ability to launch an ICBM and hit anywhere we want in the world with a nuclear weapon. So the effects of nuclear capabilities. Putting them here on the homeland also raises the price of entry of an adversary. If you want to take out our nuclear weapons, and you're going to have to come after the American homeland in order to do that with our ICBM fields, because you have our submarines, and you have our bombers, and those can be out deployed. But if you're going to have to go big, and if you're going to go big, you're going to be on the receiving end of that as well. And so you increase the price of entry for desiring to go that big against the United States. Now, we still have to work very hard at making sure that they're protected. We don't want to make it easy. It's not supposed to be there to make it unique. We want it to actually be, so one of the things that I've argued in the Strategic Posture Commission, and then also in my book, if we're going to adapt it further given the current geopolitical threats, you want to defend them. You want them to be hardened. You want them to be hard to hit. So you don't want them to be sitting ducks just because they're, that's part of their attributes. And our missile defense capabilities have significantly improved since the Cold War. So I talk about Reagan, how Ronald Reagan, of course, the Strategic Defense Initiative, he argued that you don't want to just threaten retaliatory strikes against nuclear weapons for the insurance of your national survival. You also want to provide a defense. Because not only do you not want to threaten to strike an adversary's people, Americans care more about North Korean peasants than Kim Jong-un cares about North Korean peasants. So it does not, so for us to threaten North Korean peasants to Kim Jong-un, it does not going to deter him successfully, neither is it credible. So, but neither is it, I would argue, moral to keep the American people vulnerable to a Chinese Communist Party that's not going to care as much about American lives, civilian lives, or Russians. And so you also, not only do we not want to hit their civilians on purpose, it's immoral to leave ours vulnerable on purpose if we have the technical ability to defend them. So, just in closing, our technology has greatly improved. I believe you're going to have missile defense located in space to provide that added kind of defensive layer against the American homeland, against peer threats. And one of the biggest cost drivers of that in the past has been the cost of satellite launch. But Elon Musk has proven, actually, in commercial launches, that they can do it much more cheaply than what the government has been able to do it, which has given us great encouragement that if we were serious about this and you kind of looked at that's been the biggest driver of cost. So that's encouraging. But then also technology has greatly, vastly improved since the Cold War. And so my argument is if we were very serious about this, we could look at it again in a serious way, as long as we understood it's not destabilizing, in fact. The Russians and the Chinese have been building defensive systems to make it hard for the US to have confidence we can put weapons on targets in their country. So I've argued, we should do the same thing. And that would be stabilizing, not destabilizing. So I'm excited and encouraged about the technological opportunity to be able to build a greater defense of some of our key. It's not just our ICBMs that are vulnerable. We've got ports and other things that we need to project power abroad to our allies. And if China and Russia don't want us to project power to our allies, which is fundamentally what they're trying to break. When we say breaking the international rules-based order, to an American audience, I say it's the US-led order as the preeminent power of the West. And most concretely, it's our system of alliances and our ability to come to their defense. And so the adversary wants to break that and prevent us from being able to do that. Well, how do they do that? They show us that they can put targets, they can put weapons on targets in the American homeland in a way that is credible. And they want to do that to convince the American people that, oh my goodness, it's not worth it. It's not worth it to risk escalation. But what if we had a defense? So we had the ability to make these decisions on our own terms, and that we can project power confidently, that we can provide defense of our people and the things that are critical for us, and then also retaliate and respond in a way that's that meets the need. So we got to do it. I think I sound like Trump. We got to do it. You know, but it's just I simply reject this idea that like technology has just stopped since the Cold War and it's just too hard and too expensive. You know, we can do this in a way. I think that makes sense. So.
Thank you, Rebeccah, and thank you very much for the excellent book. It's a very complicated subject, and I guess my question is, from your experience, what's the best way of explaining some of the concepts in here to the non-expert audience, whether that be the wider political class who are not expert in defence, or indeed our citizens in this country and in mine and others?
Thank you for the question. So this really is the whole ball game. I mean, it is very, very hard. So it's very, very hard. And I found myself, so back to your question, Jeremy, about what was one of the hardest things, it was very, very easy for me to just go down a rabbit trail of just explaining the you know, I do work with Stratcom, and so I do work on Congress, and then I go on Fox and try to explain things in a way that Americans can understand. And so it's a lot of different audiences for a subject so complex. And so what I tried to do is stick with my outline. It's very it's going to be very, if you are a theologian or an ethicist, you will find this probably deeply unsatisfing because I don't go into a thorough detail. I sort of mention it and I explain what the Just War Doctrine is. I explain why am I starting with the Just War Doctrine? Well, it's because the United States still appeals to the law of armed conflict. Right. The United States still has our law of war manual that we train our soldiers and our airmen from. We still defer to that. We still look to that and appeal to that. And so I thought that it was still a good place to start. Well, what is it then? What is the Just War Doctrine? I also spend some time saying, like, look, you know, the Just War Doctrine is not just for Catholics. A lot of people think like, oh, it's Aquinas, you know, that's ours, you know, that's our thing. And I'm like, well, no, not really. There's, you know, Luther appealed to the Just War Doctrine, and he talked about proportionality and discrimination. And John Calvin did as well. And you kind of move on, and Niebuhr did. So Paul Ramsey, during the Cold War, you had strategists, a niche group of strategists who were Baptists who came out and said, look, you know, we don't think that we should disarm totally either. And you had the churches that came out and put out statements. Mainline Protestants put out statements, and Presbyterians. So there's a lot there. So I just mention it. So I kind of go through there and kind of just give a little bit of a taste of where we are on this, and then get into strategy. And if you look from really the Nixon administration, I mean, we have policy documents that explain how we do targeting and what the United States will and will not do. And it's, once you have your sort of Just War Doctrine glasses on, you can see that we're appealing to discrimination, proportionality. If you have if deterrence does break down, oh, now what do we do? Yeah. You know, now we have nuclear weapons exchanges. Well, you know, if your first goal is to de-escalate, which is sort of what this administration is, everybody wants to de-escalate. It's like, actually, it's not your first goal. Your first goal is to think about, how do I achieve my military and political ends? That's what you want. Guess what? Sometimes that means it requires escalation. Yeah. So you have to be prepared. And by the way, if de-escalation is always your goal, if you kind of work that logic out, that's great. You can totally submit to your adversary. If you want, if peace is the ultimate goal, then you can submit to slavery and subjugation, and you'll get to peace eventually. But the Just War Doctrine actually upholds that peace is not the highest goal. It's justice.
Right.
And peace with justice. And so if it's peace with justice, then you have to think about how you do that. So I spend some time there and I go through, it's really amazing if you look at from the Nixon administration, Carter, and you go on, you can see that it's very encouraging as an American. It should be to allies too. It's not even partisan. It's been bipartisan across administrations that have concluded the same thing, that this is how we should do targeting, this is how we should do deterrence. If deterrence fails, we should have credible means to achieve our political military ends in a way that's credible that an American president would use. I don't want to just leave him 10 nuclear weapons, because there's some people who say, we have too many, 4,000, 3,500, that's a lot. You're going to use them all? Maybe. I mean, I hope not. But when you only give me 10, if you have 10 nuclear weapons and they're big ones, the only way you can deter is by threatening catastrophic harm. Right. Well, what about everything else the adversary might do, short of when you're willing to end their regime or to hit their cities? You find yourself actually creating a situation where you are inherently in violation of the Just War Doctrine. Right. So we want to have as many options as is necessary to hold at risk with the adversary values. That's what he needs to, and we go through what those are during the Cold War, and those targets still exist today for how we think about these categories. Keeping the adversary regime in power over their people, their military systems, and their ability to reconstitute their military systems in the event that deterrence breaks down. So you kind of look at what those target sets are and where they're located, and then that tells you what kind of weapon systems you need to be able to credibly convince your adversary you can put a weapon on that target, and that nothing's out of reach. And so when you think of your force that way, if the adversary is going to grow the number of things you have to hold at risk, to me it tells you it's going to mean that the United States is going to have to grow our force, not because we want to match one for one, but because we have to be able to have weapons that are specifically made and able to put a weapon on that target that they've now created. And so I really tried. It's just 4 chapters. It's a small book, so I was going to say massive topic, very complicated, theology, strategy, threat, different audience. And then my doctoral advisor, Keith Payne, said, and nobody reads these books that are 500 pages anymore. So you're gonna have to keep this to about 150 pages. And so I tried to do that so that people will actually sit down and read it. Hopefully, there might be parts that, I tried to heavily footnote it so they can say, oh, look, there's a lot more on this if I want to study this, and you can go off on your own study.
Yeah. And well, I'm just very thankful that you wrote this, that people like you are thinking about the ethics of these issues. And if you haven't already, get the book. It's unfortunately, it's already sold out. If you can believe it, just came out last week, already sold out. But I think we have another order coming in. So you can order on Amazon, Barnes and Noble, any other places that I'm missing.
Those are the two that they'll restock it. You can get it by Christmas. Great stock.
There you go. And we have just a few limited copies here if you want to try to grab one on your way out. But I just want to say thank you, Rebeccah, for writing this. I'm excited, and I'm thankful that you're thinking about these issues. So thank you all of you for joining us, and those online. I really appreciate it.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
Absolutely.